Hello and welcome to the Sexual Health Alliance Exceptional webinar series with Dr. David Lay. My name is Heather McPherson and I'm a couples and sex therapist in Austin, Texas, and the CEO and founder of the Sexual Health Alliance. We are excited to have David Lay on for this second webinar. The first one was a great success and it was all about ethical porn for clinicians. So if you haven't checked that out, please do on our website, www.sexualhealthalliance.com. Today's webinar is called Assisting Patients in Navigating Religion, Sex, and Porn. Dr. David Lay is a clinical psychologist in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He is an ASEX certified sex therapist and supervisor. He has published extensively in both academic works and general media, including several works on sexuality, The Myth of Sex Addiction in 2012, and Ethical Porn Predicts, A Man's Guide to Responsible Viewing Pleasure in 2016. He is a frequent commentator in the media on sexual issues with appearances on numerous radio and television shows, as well as in print media, ranging from Time Magazine to Hustler and Playboy magazines.
Thanks for, engaging in this conversation with me. What I want to be clear about as we move into this kind of dialogue is that this is very much new territory. And as we go today, my intent is to try to introduce you to the extent of the developing research and thinking in this area around how we as therapists can help patients who are struggling with conflicts between their sexual desires, their sexual behaviors, and the religious and moral values that they hold or that they were taught as children. This is, I think, territory that is somewhat new for a patient, for psychotherapy to be exploring. And so as a result, I think that we have some kind of work that we have to do to understand and acknowledge where this is, and to really kind of build some foundation. There's not a lot of foundation right now within our practice, within our clinical practice and our clinical thinking about how to address and understand these issues. Instead, I think that most of these issues, sexual conflicts, are especially around pornography, which is, I think, one of the kind of tip of the iceberg. It's the canary in the coal mine right now around these issues. Most of our thinking as a society and as therapists around these issues has been relatively reactive. My goal today is to really invite you to think about these issues in a very contextual and nuanced sort of way. What I mean by that is that as we go, I think a lot of this research and a lot of these issues and details, they're going to feel kind of internally conflicting. They're going to feel as though they are so complicated and so complex that it is almost impossible to try to sort out some synthesized threads or directions. I think they're there, though. And my goal today is to try to invite you to find those with me. Now, again, I'm going to say, and I'm going to say it at the end of today, this is very new stuff for us. This is, for the most part, very new research. This is very new thinking. And we're finding our way in this together. My goal is to share with you as much of my thinking as possible, so that we can all move forward in this together in a way that best serves our patients. Because right now, I'll be honest, I don't think we're serving them very well. This is it's a petroglyph. My recent book, Ethical Porn Predicts, is illustrated with petroglyphs. These are cave drawings chiseled into the rocks of rocks and caves in the desert, in every continent of the world, with the exception of Antarctica. There are erotic petroglyphs. There are cave drawings that show the way in which our ancestors were thinking about sexuality. This is a little guy. I call him Big Penis Man because I couldn't come up with a very creative name for him. He's about a mile and a half from my house. And he's a fellow that was carved in the rocks. And this is how he looks today, though. That a cross was carved in the rock below him, probably by Catholic settlers, as a means or an effort to try to counteract kind of the pagan power of his sexuality. In many other areas of the world, erotic petroglyphs and were chiseled off the walls, oftentimes by folks who, unfortunately, religious conservative folks who were very threatened by the overt displays of sexuality in these drawings. In other places, access to such drawings has been restricted to certain folks, typically just the wealthy or powerful males. Women, poor, and children were oftentimes weren't allowed to see them. My point in this is to say that the struggle of modern religion versus displays of overt sexuality is not a new one. This is a struggle and a conflict that has been going on for a long time. But I think what's really interesting, though, is that this conflict now is very not just overt, but it is in people's faces constantly. The access to these images now is so widespread and so unrestrictable, basically, that people are getting access to these images, these experiences, these stimuli in ways that they are not prepared to deal with, and that conflict with their training and their values, their moral beliefs, what they've been taught around sexuality. This is, I think, a good example. In Perth, Australia, a 15-year-old just last year sexually assaulted an adult woman. In court, his attorney said that this had happened because the young boy could not reconcile his religious beliefs with his sexual desires. He had developed an addiction to pornography, was watching it every night, and struggling with that conflict between his desires and what he had been taught was right. There are some significant kind of examples of this conflict. Just a couple of years ago, this was in Louisiana, I believe. New Orleans Baptist. And John Gibson was a professor who was lost to suicide a week after his name was revealed in the Ashley Madison data dump. So that when the Ashley Madison site was hacked, his name was exposed, showing that he had been on the site, using it ostensibly to find women to engage in extramarital relations with. What's really interesting, though, is that the church or the seminary where he was a very, very popular professor then held a conference where they talked about his death as the result of porn addiction. Now, I followed the case a little bit, and I'll be honest, I can't really understand how they went from Ashley Madison to porn addiction. But they did. And a ministry speaker, identified that 50% of Christian men and 20% of Christian women self-report being addicted to porn. And he suggests those are low estimates. He then goes on to say, lust is a thirsty person drinking salt water, where pornography only makes someone thirstier. That, I think, is some of the language and some of the level to which religious communities are experiencing pornography as a very significant, high-profile, challenging issue. I mean, think about it. They're saying half of all Christian men are addicted to pornography, and that it is making them thirstier for more lustful behaviors. Now, modern religion has obviously a very significant um, negative view of sexuality, identifying it as lustful. This hasn't always been the case, though. Ancient religions around the world oftentimes incorporated aspects of sacred sexuality into their religious practices. In some cases, certain religious practices even included sex work with temple prostitutes, so to speak, where engaging in sexual behavior was a part of and supportive of religious traditions. However, of course, modern religions have really taken a much more conservative stance around sexuality, where they're not talking about it. And what I think is really interesting is that Patrick Carnes, who really is kind of identified as one of the fathers of the concept of sex addiction. In 1983, he went on the Phil Donahue show, and he said, in essence, that sex addiction is the result of being raised in a highly religious family where kids are not taught to talk about or understand sexuality. I really think that that is right, and I think that that is something that we need to pay attention to. That many of the folks who are identifying as struggling with sex addiction or porn addiction, as we'll see here in moments, are folks who've grown up in religious families where they were never taught to understand their sexuality, how to manage it, how to perceive it. And now they're in a world where they have access to sexuality and sexual material that they weren't prepared to deal with. Unfortunately, though, I think that the concept of sex addiction, where it was born here in this sort of approach, understanding that this was a dilemma caused by essentially a deficit, a lack of ability or understanding or attention to these sexual matters. Unfortunately, the sex addiction industry identified sex as the target. Sex became the problem, not this lack of dialogue or this lack of understanding. And I think, unfortunately, that's tragic. I think that the sex addiction industry could have been much, much more successful, much less damaging to people if they had kept the focus on how people were not taught to talk about these issues or understand them, as opposed to targeting sex as the difficulty that should be attended to or focused on. The conservative modern religious traditions have a long history of holy wars, basically, against pornography. In the 1960s, there's a movie that was produced called Pages of Death. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. It's a little long. I think it's about 20, 30 minutes long. But it is this kind of fictional sort of narrative that was created and funded by the Catholic Church, specifically a Catholic organization in California. At the time, pornographic magazines were not restricted by age, so that children and teens could buy them. The video follows a police investigation of this sort of tragic death that allegedly, I think the murder was real. And then shows the police finding the teenage male who committed the crime, and then showing that it was pornographic magazines that he had been viewing that contributed or caused, is the implication in the movie, this horrible crime. as a result of the Catholic group's advocacy, laws were put in place restricting age access to pornographic magazines. But it wasn't enough. In 1980, morality in the media attacked Playboy that was being sold on the shelves of 7-Eleven stores. And they specifically, the group specifically identified that Playboy and pornography was addictive. They were successful getting Playboy removed from 7-Eleven shelves. Now, I know Playboy recently decided to stop showing nudity, so I wonder if 7-Eleven was now willing to put the magazines back on the shelves. But interestingly, it keeps going that Playboy, apparently they lost enough viewers and subscribers that they've now decided to put nudity back in the magazine. So I guess we're not going to see Playboy in 7-Eleven anytime soon. What's really interesting is that the morality in the media recently renamed themselves as the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, which I think is an interesting move because it changes their at least apparent focus away from morality, and now that they are simply trying to protect people from sexual exploitation. That certainly sounds nice, but I think that as we'll see, I don't think these folks are really attending to the right issues in helping people in the ways that they really need. Also in the 1980s, we saw a sort of bizarre alliance between these highly conservative religious groups opposing pornography and radical feminists who opposed pornography for radically different ideas, but coming together in these sort of strange unions with Take Back the Night, etc., where Dworkin and McKinnon, for instance, were joining forces with these highly religious folks who didn't believe in female empowerment, were very, very shaming around LGBT or sexual diversity issues. It is not by accident that the laws that were put in place back in those days restricting access to pornography, laws that were predominantly promoted by radical feminists and religious conservatives. The very first store that was prosecuted under those laws was a feminist lesbian bookstore in Canada that was prosecuted for selling pornography. So we have to explore and question the ideas around what is the sexual health model that is being promoted in these stories now, and why do folks struggle with this? Now, this is the very first commercially distributed film in history. Thomas Edison filmed this, The Kiss, 1896. It traveled the world, fairs and carnivals around the world. Our species was introduced to the moving picture by this film, and that kiss right there was identified as pornographic, and specifically again by the Catholic Church. Catholics were forbidden from seeing this film. There was a fear it was going to trigger an epidemic of public kissing. Kissing at the time in public was illegal. So the very first film ever distributed in the world was also the very first film labeled as obscene by religious organizations and identified as having an unhealthy negative impact on the sexual behaviors of religious people. What's interesting is that religious folks, and now we're going to start moving into some of the research that I want to use to build a foundation to help you understand how folks are thinking about this issue, how they experience issues around pornography within religious traditions. Now, What I want to be very, very clear about is that my intent here is not to shame or humiliate or make fun of religious traditions for their approach to dealing with pornography or sexual issues. Instead, what I really want us as therapists to do is to use this information to help us empathize and understand how folks are thinking about these issues. Jeremy Thomas has this lovely research article where he examines the way in which evangelical religious traditions and magazines, specifically Christianity Today, have been talking about pornography. He looks at the magazine, I think from the 1960s up to modern times, and finds some really interesting shifts in the language around pornography. Up until the 1970s, articles in the magazine that talked about pornography condemned it as immoral. Pornography prospers because sinners want it. Religious folks and religious traditions, though, consistently are viewing pornography in our society as evidence of the complete corruption of our culture. It is, I think, for many religious folks, a really significant hallmark identifier of this is how bad our society has gotten. These are the Roman times where our society is collapsing, and pornography is one of the best examples of that. What I thought was really interesting in Thomas's article was that he shows that each successive generation of these religious anti-porn activists view modern pornography in their time as more shocking, more damaging, more addictive, and more dangerous than the previous one. So it's so funny. Each generation in the 80s, then in the 90s, then in the 2000s, you listen to these activists, and each of them are saying, God, the pornography that exists today, it's not like it was 10 years ago. It's much more dangerous. And then in 10 years, new crop of folks are saying, well, yeah, the porn today is more dangerous than it was 10 years ago. There's a building level of anxiety and fear about this. And that's intruding into clinical practice. Religious therapists diagnose porn addiction much more than non-religious therapists, in part because that's who they're seeing. They're seeing religious folks who are struggling with these issues. They also have been taught now within religious literature to view pornography as addictive. Starting in roughly 1982, right around the same time as Patrick Carnes was publishing Out of the Shadows, the religious community also started identifying pornography as addictive, desensitizing, leading to people escalating. Where you start looking at pornography and you end up engaging in rape and killing. Ted Bundy, interviewed in, I think, 1991 by James Dobson, who led and started Morality in the Media, was a psychologist and a minister. And the argument, of course, was that Ted Bundy had started looking at pornography, and that pornography had corrupted him, turning him into this evil, violent rapist, serial killer that nobody wants their children to be. The religious literature of the day started specifically identifying the treatment for pornography as a 12-step kind of model. Now, the 12-step model is based on a spiritual tradition. It emerged from a religious kind of approach to problem behaviors. The United States Supreme Court has identified Alcoholics Anonymous and its 12-step relatives as inherently spiritual organizations. And although it is rarely followed by courts, it is actually identified as a violation of separation of church and state if a court orders somebody to attend 12-step treatment or 12-step programs. I don't really regard 12-step programs as treatment. They are social support. They're very valuable in that. But if a court orders somebody to attend 12-step programs as a part of probation or parole, they are also required actually to refer to a secular, non-religious program as well. Unfortunately, in many areas, those don't exist. And so people are being ordered into religious and spiritual programs. It's one of the reasons why many folks report kind of bad experiences with 12-step programs, because they are forced to accept a religious and a spiritual foundation which they may not share. Evangelicals and highly religious folks today are consistently now painting pornography as a biological disease. They're talking about the brain. It's fascinating to hear religious speakers with absolutely no training in psychology or neuroscience talking about the way the brain responds to pornography and how that addiction is created. Why? Thomas suggests something really interesting. Thomas suggests that conservative religious leaders may be motivated to embrace the idea of porn addiction because it relieves them of moral responsibility for their members' pornography use. He suggests that the concept of porn addiction may offer ways to view this problem as an external treatable problem rather than one that reflects moral and intrinsic failings of a person. So I recently heard a very interesting story relating to this, where a man sought a assessment for sex addiction, came from a highly conservative religious tradition, had reported to his pastor that he was engaging in homosexual behaviors. He was stopping at adult bookstores, for instance, and having sex with other men. And the pastor said, well, you need to get a diagnosis of sex addiction because otherwise you're basically going to have to be kicked out of the church. So this individual went to a therapist for an assessment for sex addiction. The therapist was, one of those growing numbers who don't believe that sex addiction is an effective or an appropriate kind of diagnosis or strategy. Assessed the guy and said, basically you're not, you don't have a sexual behavior problem. You have these desires, and you're sometimes engaging in them. The guy went back to his pastor, and the pastor said, well, then your only option for staying in the church, for staying in this religious tradition, is to go to conversion therapy and attempt to change your sexual orientation. Because otherwise, if it's not an addiction, if it's not a disease, if it's not something that's in your brain and not in your soul, we're going to have to kick you out. The XXX Church is a ministry that specifically focuses on porn stars and porn viewers, trying to bring them back into the church, helping them to, quote, give up pornography, both participating in it or watching it. The XXX Church specifically views porn as a biological addiction. And interestingly, they argue that watching too much pornography turns people gay, that homosexuality is the result of high levels of pornography consumption and viewing. So the idea of porn addiction, by painting it as something external, by painting it as a force that changes somebody's brain, by painting it as a disease, now as opposed to a moral failing, it changes how the church can respond to this issue, and allows them to keep people in the church who are struggling with this issue, without having to simply exclude them as engaging in immoral behaviors. I first got interested in this kind of issue as I was writing The Myth of Sex Addiction. And one of the really powerful pieces of research that I found was published by Jason Winters in 2010. Jason is a psychologist in Canada. This was a part of his dissertation, and he was one of the first researchers to start examining and testing some of the beliefs and ideas around sex addiction. He showed that, interestingly, self-identified sex addicts don't have any more difficulty controlling their sexual behaviors than anybody else. That they were more likely to be members of organized religions, and to feel that religion was important to them. People who seek out treatment for sex addiction or porn addiction are more likely to come from a organized religion. Winters in 2010 was one of the first to start really demonstrating this empirically, and start pointing us in the direction of where this issue is coming from. Now, it is an interesting fact that participating in an organized religion, feeling that religion is important to a person, is a protective factor from developing behavioral health, mental health problems, emotional disorders, or substance use problems. So being in a religious community, participating in regular religious church activities, reduces the risk that somebody is going to develop emotional problems such as anxiety disorders, depression, or that they're going to struggle with a substance use disorder such as alcoholism or issues around methamphetamine or cocaine, etc. Why? Because that community offers social engagement and support around dealing with emotional issues or substance use issues. For grins sometime, look at the ministries, church ministries around emotional issues, around things like drugs and alcohol, around things like cancer. They are filled with very supportive language. They talk about the need to help people recover and deal with these issues. Unfortunately, participation in a religious community, being part of an organized religion, actually increases the risk for developing a sexual disorder, a variety of sexual disorders, whether it's erectile dysfunction, anorgasmia, premature ejaculation, etc. What's very, very interesting is that being part of a religious community and identifying religion as important to a person predicts an increased likelihood that that person is going to have specific struggles around sexuality. The sexual compulsivity scale is developed by Kalikman. It is one of the more common tests designed to assess sex addiction or sexual compulsivity. What's really interesting was that some research with the sexual compulsivity scale showed that it accidentally diagnoses as sexually compulsive clergy members, not because these clergy members are actually engaging in sexual problematic behaviors, although, of course, as we know, some are, but because these clergy members view their sexual desires as something to struggle with, to be afraid of, and to try to suppress and control. What that means is that the sexual compulsivity scale and that the idea of sex addiction and sexual compulsivity itself is born from the idea that you must control and suppress your sexual desires. That sexual arousal is something to be afraid of and to work to suppress, to tamp down. Alexander Stulhofer is a Croatian researcher in Europe, and again, very, very interestingly, very recently found that problematic hypersexual folks in this study were more likely to be religious, and specifically to hold negative attitudes about porn and about one's own sexuality. So this is starting now to lead us towards the idea, towards understanding it's not just religion, okay? It is religion that teaches us to be afraid of our own sexuality and to have negative attitudes about our sexual arousal. Now, and this is where some of these foundational kind of research data points start to conflict. Okay, they start to sound like they don't add up, but I think they do, and I think we can navigate a path through this. Folks who are religious report less porn use. And Paul Wright, who's a wonderful researcher at Indiana University, has done some of the best research around kind of longitudinal effects of pornography. Wright is not a fan of pornography. And one of the things that may surprise you here is that I'm going to be referencing research by folks who are on kind of the anti-porn side. But I think that the nuance that they bring to this conversation is important. What Wright found was that religiosity was not actually a significant factor in changing porn use. So we have to consider the question of, is reporting porn use the same thing as using porn? Especially when you've been taught that porn is shameful and you've been taught to suppress and fear and hide your sexual desires, reporting porn use may not be the same thing as actually using it. Religious folks are more likely to view pornography as unhealthy while they still continue to use it. And that people with negative attitudes towards pornography are actually more likely to experience negative effects from their use. I often relate this issue, and this is a piece that we find in lots and lots of research around pornography and pornography effects, and we're going to review some of those here in just a moment. I relate it to research around casual sex, that if you believe that people who have casual sex are slutty and bad or unhealthy, then you're more likely to feel bad about yourself if you have casual sex. Now, casual sex oftentimes involves alcohol. 90% of casual sex involves the use of alcohol. Why? Because people are using alcohol to overcome those internal prohibitions that they have against casual sex. They want to engage in this behavior, but they have internal blocks against it. They use alcohol to overcome it. Then when they're sober and hungover, they feel guilty and crappy about this behavior they engaged in. Stay with that, hold on to that thread, because I think that conflict between our values and then our behaviors is driving a lot of this issue. It is not by accident that religious states actually use more pornography. That Utah, for instance, had the highest level of subscriptions to pornographic magazines compared to any other state per capita in the United States, back when people were still subscribing to porn magazines. Now, consistently, religious states are finding higher levels of pornography use through the internet. Pornhub commonly releases their data on who's using or downloading their porn. Religious states are kind of highly represented. It is a question, though. Is it religious people in those states that are watching the pornography? Or is it non-religious people in those highly religious states who are watching more pornography because these states don't allow or support open conversations or issues around sexuality or sexual discussions? Kind of don't know. And I think that now starts to raise questions about where these conflicts are coming from. And this, I think, now starts us to, again, start to take a more nuanced exploration around how these issues of sexual struggles around pornography specifically involve the internal person as opposed to the external. Remember, the church and religious leaders, as they've talked about pornography, more preferentially want us to focus on the external, the impact of this external media on our brain. Josh Grubbs, though, is a researcher. He's at Bowling Green State University in Ohio, I believe it is. I always forget where it is. And as part of his dissertation, he did some really remarkable research. Now, Grubbs is a self-identified conservative Christian researcher around sexuality and religiosity. And his research, I think, has done more to move this conversation forward than almost anybody I've seen. What Grubbs found in very large samples, very well done research, he found that, consistent with some of the things we've talked about, religious individuals are more likely to deny using porn, but amongst those religious folks who admit using porn, their level of religiosity doesn't actually predict level of use. What that means is that being more religious doesn't actually impact how much they use pornography. Think about that now as we work with patients, that the more religious they identify themselves, it doesn't mean that they're actually going to be less likely to use pornography. Again, it suggests they may be less likely to admit using pornography. But the level of religiosity did predict perceived addiction to pornography. So in this study, Grubbs controlled for actual porn use, how much pornography they were using, and controlled for personality variables that might, predict kind of identifying as addictive or addicted, and found that the stronger a person's religious beliefs, the more likely they viewed their porn use, which, remember, religion doesn't predict a level of porn use. So that the stronger a person's religious values, the more likely they were to identify as addicted to pornography. So these are folks growing up in a church that since the 1980s has been consistently identifying pornography as addictive. They are using pornography, and they know it conflicts with their sexual behaviors, with their use of pornography. They've been taught morally that use of pornography is inappropriate and unacceptable within the church, and it's addictive. And that moral disapproval is what is underlying the connection between religion and perceived porn addiction. So that, again, this is where the nuance and the thread starts to develop here, is that it's not just being religious that is causing the problem, but it is the religious traditions around moral disapproval of sexuality that then lead to self-identification as a porn addict. And unfortunately, that perceived porn addiction, seeing yourself as addicted, seeing yourself as having a brain disease caused by this pornography, actually makes people worse, regardless of how much pornography they actually use. These folks are more likely to identify themselves as addicted because of religious values, and that self-identity as a porn addict predicts greater struggles, predicts they're going to feel worse about themselves. One of the things that's often said within the sex addiction industry is that their intent is to reduce shame. That's actually one of the things that Carnes did in a lot of their treatment and in a lot of sex addiction treatment. It starts by trying to reduce shame and by trying to allow people to admit these behaviors that they've kept secret because of shame. One of the ways that the sex addiction industry tries to reduce shame, and that the addiction industry, folks like ASAM, the American Society of Addictive Medicine, specifically intend to reduce shame around these drug, alcohol, and sexual behaviors, identifying it as a brain disease by saying that this is a disease, not just an immoral behavior. There's the idea that that will reduce shame. In fact, some Canadian research suggests that shame, that identifying emotional problems, behavior problems, drug and alcohol problems as being brain based increases stigma, actually increases the degree to which people view then their behaviors as unchanging. So think about that. Then these folks growing up in religious traditions, which are painting pornography as addictive, painting it as though it changes your brain, they're now realizing and learning and experiencing that because their brain has been changed, they can't control this behavior and struggling with it. And then every time they're tempted to use pornography, they feel worse about it and feel worse about themselves. And that struggle, that use of pornography affects their religious beliefs. It affects their faith that people who use the pornography, who view themselves as addicted to pornography and are religious, actually become less religious over time. They experience more crises of faith. They question the existence of God. They experience more guilt and shame over their use. And that struggle is not predicted by how much pornography they're actually watching. Okay. The struggle is again predicted by their identity as a porn addict and their level of religiosity, specifically their moral values that they have against sexuality and pornography. Okay. Again, we have to follow that thread and try and navigate that nuance. In research by Griffin et al., and all these references will be at the end and or attached to this when you purchase or watch this video. I wanted to give you the references so you knew where I was getting this information. Griffin et al. Found that these hypersexual behaviors were positively associated with a moral struggle, but only in those who consider their values and their behavior to be incongruent. Do you see how that works? Again, that it is the conflict between your values and behavior, just like the people who engage in casual sex and then feel worse about it the next day because they view casual sex negatively. In these folks who view their desires and their values to be conflicting, it increases the negative effect that has on their life, on their moral struggle, and their religious values. Now, this is really interesting. Within this within research, Bradley et al., 2016, there was a very large, it was a special edition of the Journal on Sex Addiction and Compulsivity, which is funny because it's a journal that I've hated for years. But they published a special edition that was actually edited by Josh Grubbs, and that was all about the religious conflict with pornography and how these issues play into the role of porn addict or sex addict. Really, it's a valuable journal, and a lot of the research I'm talking about comes out of that. There, higher certainty in God's existence was associated with higher levels of self-perceived porn addiction. Atheists in this research were reporting very low levels, if any, of porn addiction. Now, Rob Weiss is a famous sex addiction therapist, one of the folks that's out in the media very often, and he challenges this, and he identifies as either agnostic or atheist, I forget. But he has bought into and identifies as the 12-step kind of model, which is a spiritually based model. Regardless, in this research, Rob is pretty rare. People who believe God exists are more likely to view themselves as addicted to pornography, and that self-identification as being religious, and this is a broad category. This included not just conservative Christians in the United States, but it included conservative Muslims. And I know that, I have seen a number of Muslim men come in for treatment with me, identifying struggles around pornography and viewing themselves as addicted to pornography. So this is not about just necessarily Christian attitudes towards sex. And again, this is part of where I think that we could go wrong. We need to navigate this about religion and sexual values, not about specific religions. Again, as folks are struggling with their use of pornography, as they're identifying being porn addicts, and these are religious folks, they experience an increase in anger towards God. Now, think about how religions are going to experience that. They're going to experience it as an attack on them. Different religions have different views of pornography itself and views of sexuality itself. Levels of religiosity in most research is predicting more strict sexual values, feeling worse at violating sexual boundaries or sexual morals, more likely to restrict a person's sexual fantasy, and religious people report fewer lifetime sexual partners. Some of that's going to come back in a little bit, and I hope I can draw that thread together for you. The Christian Bible doesn't actually talk about pornography, even though the pornography cave drawings painted on the walls of Pompeii, etc., were around. But the Bible does talk about lust. And so as we start to view and deal with these issues, the idea of what is healthy sexuality within a religious tradition is one of the things that is driving this question. If the religion identifies that the only appropriate healthy sexuality is within heterosexual married couples for having babies or making the relationship closer, that religion is more likely to struggle with issues around pornography. 90% of pornography use includes masturbation. Most of these religious prohibitions against pornography are actually religious prohibitions against masturbation, because masturbation doesn't fit the model of their healthy sexuality. As we go through this conversation, I don't want you to think that it is appropriate to be antagonistic towards religion. We have to view religion as inherently valuable, productive, and effective for people. It offers something really tremendous. What is religion for? What does it do? It regulates social interactions. It has religious communities and traditions restrict certain behaviors and teach people to control them so that they can fit into the community. And it builds community support, belonging, and offers through that support for people through faith and through connections with other people within the church to get through hard life events. It offers meaning to life. These are all really important, valuable things that religions across the world provide to people. These are amazing, positive things that we as therapists oftentimes have not dealt well with. Freud identified religion as infantile and viewed it as something that mature, psychologically developed people didn't believe in. It is not by accident that most therapists don't talk about religion. I mean, think about it. What are the things that most therapists don't talk about with their patients? Most therapists, 50% of therapists don't talk about sex with their patients. None of us really talk about religious values with our patients. And God help us, none of us talk about politics with our patients. I mean, it was funny during the Trump election. One of the things I saw lots and lots of therapists talking about was their struggles as they had patients talking about supporting Trump, because many therapists were more liberal or Democratic and didn't. And those therapists didn't know how to navigate those conversations. God knows I didn't. I had some of those conversations with patients, and that's tough because we've not been taught how to talk about those issues. Why? Oftentimes we view religion in pretty negative ways within mental health. When with mental health traditions commonly view religions as potentially expressions of pathology, compulsion, weak personalities. We talk about hyper religiosity in our patients. We don't deal very well with the two-sided nature of religion. And what I mean by that, when it comes to mental health, religion is, as I said, protective and helpful to many people who are struggling with mental health and our emotional issues. But at the same time, religion and religiosity can oftentimes worsen mental health issues. So there is this internal paradox and conflict within religious communities as they deal with mental health issues, and as people who are religious experience or deal with their mental health issues. We can see sometimes, psychosis or delusions that are deeply religious in nature, as folks have grown up within religious communities and started to experience those mental health issues. These are some of the reasons that the therapists and mental health folks commonly view religion in pretty negative sorts of ways. Kenneth Pargament is a professor. He just retired, actually. He's also at Bowling Green State University, and Josh Grubbs is kind of now stepping into Pargament's shoes in some ways. Pargament has written some books about helping therapists to effectively talk about or acknowledge religion and therapy and navigate some of this complex, nuanced kind of level. How do we help patients access the positive benefits of religion? The HOPE evaluation is one interesting kind of tool that I offer to therapists, where it gives us some guidance on how to talk to patients about religion. What are your sources of hope and meaning and comfort? Again, so this is driving us towards, what do people get out of religion? What is the positive benefits of religion? Are you participating in an organized religion? Knowing that those folks who participate in organized religions have a greater likelihood of social support and connections. What are your personal spirituality practices? Now, I think that's an interesting and a nuanced kind of question, because it now invites us to consider the idea that somebody who participates in an organized religion may not necessarily have personal religious values that mirror identically the values or beliefs of their organized religion. That's something now to start a thread to carry. And then how does that spirituality affect end-of-life issues? And how does your religion help you think about what happens after death? And one of the things I want to add to that is, how does your religion affect your views of sexuality? These are some of the questions now that I think start directing us towards how we can help people navigate these internal conflicts around pornography, sexuality, and their religious values. Because religious communities are viewing pornography as more dangerous than gun violence and racism. Fascinating research indicating that more religious people view the access to pornography and the pornification of our society as more ultimately dangerous, corrupting, and leading to the destruction of our society than gun violence and racism. Now, think again, who are these folks that are saying this? They're often folks that live in rural areas. They're not living in more urban areas where gun violence and racism is more overt and talked about and a greater struggle. But they are people who have access to the internet and are seeing each other and themselves struggle with pornography. So I say this, and I think that the value of this research is, again, not to make fun of religious people for, oh my God, they think porn is more dangerous than gun violence, but to say, think about what they are experiencing. Fewer of them are experiencing gun violence in their daily lives and communities, but they sure as hell are experiencing pornography access through the internet as something that they and their neighbors and loved ones are experiencing and potentially struggling with. When you talk to those folks about religious states using pornography more religious folks are more likely to find different explanations. What does that mean? They're more likely to find ways to explain that finding through bad research, for instance, or researcher bias, than to acknowledge that this is a struggle that is something coming out in the religious communities. Think about that. They are less able and willing to acknowledge or explore the idea that their fear of pornography and their struggles over pornography are emerging from this religious conflict. They've been taught that pornography is changing your brain and is a disease process. And when we offer them alternate ways of thinking about that, they reject it and they don't want to think about that. A couple of years ago, North Carolina, there was a religious conference on pornography. Baptists, Catholics, Latter-day Saints came together talking about the dangers of pornography. And at that research, they presented data showing that highly religious teens viewed not recycling as more sinful than watching pornography. Now, the religious folks at this conference were really dismayed by that research, and they said, we've got to do a better job of teaching teens how dangerous pornography is. I look at it and think two things. I think, one, that means that this issue around pornography is a generational issue. The struggle around pornography is a generational problem that in 15 or 20 years will look different. And secondly, I think those kids are going to save the planet, and they don't really care that much about pornography. But look again at the way when data conflicts with religious communities' perceptions of pornography, there is a backlash and a struggle and an intent to change it. Now, this is a picture from a video called Wounded on the Battlefield. I'm not going to show you the video because it was produced by Brigham Young University in Idaho, and it is a public service kind of announcement that was prepared for Brigham Young students. It got released on the internet. And the church and BYU was really kind of humiliated by it and around it because it presents the struggle around pornography use in these hyperbolic kind of terms with World War II imagery. This kid here in World War II kind of soldier gear. That's the way the movie portrays this battle over pornography. The Brigham Young, however, went after people who have reposted the video and are trying to now constrict it and limit access to it because it exposes two things. It exposes, one, the degree to which they are viewing pornography as addictive and teaching people about it. And two, it exposes the degree to which they are experiencing this as a war, a holy war, a battle. And that language is really important. Now, I invite you to reach out and find that video. We're not showing it here because we don't want Shah to get attacked by BYU for showing the video. But I encourage, and I am a therapist, to watch it. Again, not because I'm telling you to view Brigham Young as silly for doing this, but to listen to the language. In the video, they talk about the enemy, they talk about war, they talk about battle, they call pornography the Great War, they talk about people being left on the battlefield. as you look online about religion and religious attitudes towards pornography, the language that comes up is this polemic, polarized, hyperbolic, adversarial language. Think about what that language does. Think about how that language treats now pornography in these extreme ways, and it teaches religious people to view pornography in these extreme kind of manners. Jason Willoughby is a researcher at Brigham Young University in Salt Lake City. He again is one of these folks who is developing some really nuanced, I think, sort of attitudes and views of pornography. What he found in this really interesting research was that religious individuals are more likely to classify lots of things as pornography. Fredericks of Hollywood magazine is one of the things that religious folks are more likely to call pornographic. What he found also is that because these religious folks view more things as pornography, they rate things like Fredericks of Hollywood catalog as being very pornographic. That then, when they are shown or encounter things like, pretty extreme kinds of pornography, rough sex kind of pornography, or even bestiality and stuff like that, they've already classified other things that lots of us would view as less pornographic or less extreme sort of material. They've kept out. They have a ceiling effect. What does that mean? What that means is that these folks can't necessarily distinguish. They've not been taught how to distinguish between different kinds of pornography. They view it all the same. And that participating in religious services, being married, being male, and if they have a low level of experience of pornography, they're more likely to view more things as being very pornographic. Finally, again, hang on to that thread because it's going to come back in just a little bit when we talk about some of the ways I think we can start to help them. Tongarin et al. In that same journal article showed that they could prime people's thinking, that by inviting people to think about their religious values about sex or pornography, and then inviting them to think about watching pornography in a way that they're not supposed to within their marriage or relationship, increased their feeling negative about the porn use, and increased the degree to which they were likely to perceive that pornography as being negative on their partner and on the marriage, and that they were more likely then to view pornography as infidelity. Okay, so people who are thinking about their religious values and then use pornography or think about using pornography are more likely to see it as negative. Remember what I said about the people who view pornography as immoral are the people who are more likely to experience the negative effects of it because of their thinking around it, because of the degree to which their the consciousness, the degree to which their religious values against pornography use are present in their mind. It influences then the degree to which they are likely to view it as damaging and unhealthy in their lives and in their relationships. 50% of the books on Amazon about porn addiction are in the religion section. Most of the porn addiction treatment centers in the United States are religious, a significant majority of them, and more of the there are more religious, there are more porn addiction treatment centers and therapists in highly religious areas. Both because that's where these people are struggling, and because that is how religious people are thinking of these struggles around pornography. Donald Hilton is a neurologist who is commonly cited by folks like Your Brain on Porn and the NoFap community, because Donald Hilton argues that pornography is changing your brain. Interestingly, Hilton has a book where he suggests that the only way to break the bonds of pornography addiction are by belief in Christ. 50% of the people in organized sex addiction treatment in the United States are religious, married, heterosexual men. Interestingly, in that group, religion didn't predict levels of sexual behavior or experiencing consequences as a result of it. But it did predict, consistent with other research, fewer sex partners and fewer sex behaviors. And those folks, again, consistent with other research, the religious folks had lower levels of behavioral health or substance use problems. So religious participation had been protective for them from those issues, but it increased their likelihood of viewing masturbation as problematic for them and addictive for them. The religious community, the folks in that religious sample were more likely to be struggling with porn and masturbation than with things like infidelity, identifying it as addictive. This is where I think now we can start to try to navigate how this works. Volk et al. Offers this sophisticated kind of statistical analysis where they showed that just growing up in a religious household doesn't predict feelings of sexual shame around pornography use. Okay? But it follows a thread that growing up in a household that was religious, developing then personal religiosity, having moral attitudes that are negative towards sexuality and pornography use, perceiving oneself as addicted to sex or porn, leads then to the experience of sexual shame. So as we as a therapist are working with patients around this, you can't just go, you can't just jump from, oh, you grew up in a religious household to you're experiencing this sexual shame and we need to treat that. You have to follow the thread of how all of these things connect. I think this is one of the strategies that I'm now suggesting for therapists that I'm trying to use in therapy is not confronting or challenging these struggles around pornography by basing it in this religious conflict, but by helping people to understand how they came to be a person who feels this way about their pornography or their sexual behaviors, helping them to understand how this stair-step connection worked, helping them to maybe explore for themselves how they ended up with this idea that addiction to sex or porn is real, because that's what the religious communities perceive, how they developed negative attitudes or moral attitudes about sex, how those came from their personal religiosity, and how their personal religiosity came from what they were taught as children. This also now invites us as therapists to start thinking about what do we target? Where do we address now these issues in trying to help people? Sexual shame. The sex addiction model really intended, I think, to reduce people's sexual shame, identifying that it was sexual shame that was causing. Remember, Carnes said, growing up in religious families that didn't talk about sex leads to sex addiction. They really explicitly identify that shame is the cause of sex addiction. And a lot of sex addiction therapists are writing about this. What I think is sad, unfortunate, is that they don't realize that the degree to which they are teaching people to be afraid of and stigmatize their sexual behaviors, identifying sex as the problem, is actually increasing people's sexual shame. McClintock is a very nice book. It's about sexual shame. She is a minister, and she talks about the fact that sexual shame actually causes more shame, and it inadvertently reinforces the behavior. People who don't live up to their own ideals feel shame. Think about that. This is, again, the conflict between your moral values about sexuality and your behavior makes you ashamed. What I talk about the difference, shame and guilt. This is a gross simplification of these concepts, but what I like to explore is, within Catholic traditions, if you engage in a sinful behavior, you feel guilt, and then you go to confession and you pray and are absolved of your guilt. You walk away and you're washed clean. But within Japanese traditions, shame, uh, we, shame is the driver. That if you engage in a socially unacceptable behavior, it reflects who you are, not just what you did, who and what you are. And oftentimes within Asian traditions, I watched the movie 47 Ronin last night, and it shows, people engaging in ritual suicide, because once you have shamed yourself, your behavior reveals that you are unsavable. Suicide is the only way out. You have to get rid of yourself to wash away the shame for that behavior. What you did reflects who and what you are, not just the fact that you made a bad choice or a bad decision. There's a nice dissertation. It's online. I recommend it, by a research. I think she's a social worker from Austin. Kyle, the Kyle Inventory of Sexual Shame. Again, the reference is in the references, I think. And she identifies shame was initially conceptualized as a deterrent from wrongdoing that would decrease impropriety. Shame was a way that society was trying to get people to stop engaging in problematic behaviors. But she then reviews research around shame and sexual shame specifically, showing that the belief that sexual shame changes people's behavior doesn't work. That it just leads people to keep that behavior secret and struggle with it more. Alex Katahakis is clinical director of Sex Addiction Treatment Center in LA. Last year, she was quoted in this article about the sex addiction controversy. And she gave this remarkable statement. She said, sex addicts need to feel shame about what they're doing because they're shameless. And when people are shameless, they rape, murder, steal, pillage, and get into politics. Now, I think the politics comment is actually kind of funny. But when I commented on this on Twitter, Alex came after me, and she really felt like I was attacking her and misunderstanding. And she said that what she does is uses healthy pro-social shaming to try to control people's sexual behaviors. But what Kyle shows us in the research that she reviews and in her own research is that there's no such thing as healthy pro-social shame. That shame actually makes behavior change harder, and it increases the degree to which, as an addict, see how this is coming together now, where that shame about your behavior and your desires drives the self-perception of being addicted and having this thing in you that you can't control. That comes into marriage as well. And this is some of the nuance, okay? That marriages where both partners watch pornography show no negative effect from the pornography use. Interestingly, marriages where the wife uses pornography show an increased sexual satisfaction in the couple, but the wife is less likely to be individually satisfied. So what that means is maybe the wife is watching pornography to increase her libido or to explore sexuality in a way that then she uses to try to satisfy her husband, but it doesn't appear focused on her own pleasure. It is couples where one partner uses porn in secret. It's usually the man, where the pornography predicts them decreased relationship satisfaction and more likely divorce. Multiple research studies are showing that the role of religion in these factors is kind of complicated and not something that we really fully understand. But it appears in most of this research that being religious, participating in a religious community, and using pornography increases, again, remember what we were talking about a little ago, increases the likelihood that you're going to view that pornography use as unhealthy in the relationship, more likely to keep it secret because you're not going to admit to it. Perry, I think he's in Oklahoma, also found something related, that participating in religion predicts better parenting. Religious people actually are more likely to be close and engage in better kind of parenting skills than non-religious people. But if a person is religious and using pornography, it predicts a worse parenting relationship than if the person is non-religious and using pornography. Okay, can you follow that? Think then about the shame that father feels about himself using pornography, and how that shame causes him to pull back from his parents. And that's what Perry's research shows, is that religious porn users pull back from their kids and feel more shame about themselves and are worse parents as a result of it. That, I think, now starts to point us to how we can help, okay? That these struggles are predicted primarily by their values conflict. The conflict between your beliefs about porn and sex, and then your behaviors. So one man I worked with, he was highly religious, had grown up in what's called the penitente culture. The penitente culture is a northern New Mexico, very old Catholic community, where they still engage in things like flagellation, whipping themselves with thorns and stuff as a way to absolve themselves of sin. He was struggling with pornography, and specifically, he still liked the dial-up porn lines and casual sex. And one of the things that he would do is he'd engage in these behaviors, and then he would feel absolutely awful. He'd beat himself up. Beat himself up. Remember the flagellation? He would beat himself up emotionally and just tear himself down. Now, when somebody is engaging repetitively in a behavior that they feel bad about, one of the questions I often ask is, do you actually kind of want to feel bad? Is that maybe what you're looking for? And when we started to explore that, this was a guy who was very self-critical, and he beat himself up about lots of things I don't think he needed to beat himself up about. And these were oftentimes things that he couldn't change about himself. But when he engaged in that specific behavior and then he beat himself up about that specific behavior, it gave him a way to hyper focus and isolate that issue. So we worked on all these issues, and we started to work on what were his actual values about sex, what were his values about relationships with other people, were his values about his sexual values that he developed in religion, the exact values that he now, as an older adult, felt were right and appropriate and proper in his life, that he wanted to choose existentially and authentically in his life. And he started to realize that, he could be a good Catholic and engage in these sexual behaviors. He came in one day and he said that he had had a desire to engage in a Craigslist hookup a few days before. And that before he did it, he sat down and he went through his values. He went through how he's feeling about himself, what he was going to get out of this potential behavior, why he was maybe wanting to engage in that behavior, what the behavior meant. At the end of the day, he did actually decide to go and have a Craigslist hookup. And what's really interesting is that he didn't feel bad afterwards. He didn't beat himself up because he didn't have a need to beat himself up, because he had made a conscious decision that was consistent with his values. He had now explored what his values were, and he was trying to drive his behavior with his values. Values clarification therapy is a strategy, and there's they have cards that they can use where they invite people to start sorting their values and examining their values. I think it's one of the strategies that we might start looking at to help people understand and examine and think about what their values are. Most people don't. Most people don't ever sit down and think about what their values are, where they came from, how they feel about them. That's one of the things I talk about in Ethical Porn for Dicks. Is I invite people to think about their attitudes towards pornography, their values about pornography, when they're not watching porn. They need to think about these things when they're not turned on, because when we're turned on, we're more likely to be impulsive, and have poor judgment about our sexual behaviors and desires. In Ethical Porn for Dicks, and as I'm working with therapists, that's what I start to now talk to people about is, how do you feel about pornography? What do you think about pornography? What are your ideas about pornography? And remember that religious people have a very flat definition of pornography. They view it all as the same. Frederick's A Hollywood Catalog versus hardcore, triple X, graphic, gynecological porn. Can we now start to explore some of the nuances? Can we start to help people examine and recognize that there are levels of pornography, and that this kind of extreme pornography up here may not be as safe as this lower kind of pornography down here? In other words, this pornography may be what you really regard as immoral, but this pornography down here may not be as immoral, and you may not have to feel bad for using this kind of pornography. Are there acceptable forms of pornography that you might not have to feel bad about from watching? I like to start expanding people's definitions and words and concepts. Remember, the language they have been taught about pornography is battle, enemy, the holy war, great war, wounded, issues around Satan and sin and lust. Can we instead now start to teach words and concepts like sexual self-esteem, sexual narcissism? Can we now start to explore the idea, helping people to think about how you can be less sexually selfish instead of viewing pornography as immoral just because it's pornography? What if we now started to talk about the idea of, well, maybe it's a problem because watching pornography is a selfish behavior for you, and is there a way to watch it or engage in it in your life in a way that's not selfish, where you're not leaving your wife out potentially of this behavior or of this experience in your life? Can we now start to normalize it? Can we start to explore the idea of being a sexual person of honor, having sexual integrity? Can we start to help people start to unpack and think about sexuality as a bigger conversation, a bigger concept, as opposed to just sex? Can we recognize that there are 50 shades of gray, that there are thousands of shades of gray within sexual behaviors and values, and that just that's one certain behavior, you can't tell if it's immoral or not unless you start to unpack the ideas, values, and ways that you engaged in that behavior. Was there consent? Was there responsibility? Were you being selfish? Were you communicating? Was there respect and dignity in it? Religious folks that are struggling with porn, the Plicit model of sex therapy, I think, is very, very useful, where the idea is, offering permission to experience these feelings and these behaviors and these stimuli, giving people permission potentially to think about pornography, to be tempted by pornography, giving them some information, some education around what pornography is and isn't, and what pornography reflects, and what masturbation is and isn't, starting to normalize this, offering people the acknowledgement of the sexual information that they weren't taught as kids, giving people some structured strategies, some specific strategies. The Sam Brownback is currently governor of Kansas, and when he was a senator, he held hearings about pornography and the dangers of pornography. He told stories about men that he knew that when they checked into a hotel, they had to have the television removed from the hotel so that in the middle of the night they wouldn't be tempted to watch pornography. Brownback told that story as a way of saying, look how dangerous pornography is. I tell patients that exact same story, but I tell it as a way of teaching men how to make better decisions in advance of times where they would be tempted to engage in behaviors that would conflict with their values. Those guys were really smart, actually. Those guys were men who knew that in the middle of the night, when they were lonely and tired and horny and away from their family, they might engage in a behavior that they would regret in the morning. So they made decisions earlier on to help themselves make better decisions in a time when they would be tempted or disposed to make poor decisions. That is one of the strategies that we can start teaching people in ways for them to better understand and prioritize and troubleshoot this struggle around pornography. Paul Milan is a Mormon man. He's a writer, and he has just one of the most brilliant pieces I've seen about this struggle. I really highly recommend you read it. There's a link to it. It is a letter that he wrote ostensibly to his sons about pornography. His sons had the ability now to see pornography on their iPod, and their sons were kind of struggling because they had been taught to fear pornography within their religious tradition. I think that Paul navigates this really, really well. And one of the things he says is, look, our religion isn't very good at dealing with pornography. He points out something really interesting. He points out that as their religious tradition talks about pornography, that they are blurring the line between arousal and pornography. That being turned on is experienced as pornographic, lustful, that there's not shades of arousal versus lust. That's a really important distinction. And this is one of the things I pointed out a while ago, that connects to that flat view, that there are levels of arousal, there's levels of pornography, and that people who are not taught about pornography, not taught about their sexuality, lose the ability to have thoughtful conversations about it. Milan offers now context where people can start to learn how to navigate pornography in these ways. We're at 90 minutes. Obviously, I'm probably going to go about 10 or 15 minutes long, and I hope that's okay. Pornography isn't the enemy, he says. Shame is the enemy. Shame about sexual arousal. And this is where I think this article is really, really helpful and useful, because it starts to help us point at shame is the thing. Sexual shame is the thing that's hurting people and that is struggling, not simply pornography. The Religious Institute is also one of the tools that I'm using to help people navigate and wrestle with these issues. The Religious Institute is a consortium of about 5,000 ministers and pastors from around the world who came together and said, religions aren't very good at sex. Same thing Paul is saying. Paul Milan, not Paul in the Bible, sorry. And the Religious Institute says our culture needs a sexual ethic focused on personal relationships and social justice. That we need to start teaching people how to have healthy sexual values, as opposed to condemning certain sex acts like masturbation or anal sex or homosexuality or infidelity. Instead, let us start looking at those sexual values. Again, this is where I think we as therapists can really help, by helping people now to examine their sexual values that are conflicting with their sexual behaviors. Instead of just saying, well, you feel bad about your use of pornography because you grew up in a religious community and you grew up as religious. Instead, let us start to focus now and help people examine and think about, what are their sexual values? What were they taught about sexuality within their religious tradition? And now, are those religious are those religious values ones that they adopt and view as appropriate today? Remember, young people today view homosexuality and gay marriage as acceptable. They are less likely to be concerned about privacy and sexual privacy as well. Young people today, 45% of of millennials don't view monogamy as a necessity for relationships. There are some really significant generational shifts around sexual values. And religious folks who are struggling with pornography are in the society where these shifts are happening, but I don't think they've examined their sexual values. One of the ways I'm encouraging therapists to think about this is to apply lessons from the coming out process. Most therapists have some experience working with gay individuals who are working through coming out. And we have some idea of how to help them now think about how they can be an out gay or lesbian individual, different from what they were taught was right or healthy within their family or their community, and now trying to navigate what kind of gay out person do I want to be. I'm encouraging the therapist to look at these sexual shifts and these changes in sexual values similar to the way that we help people come out. What if you came out as a sexual being within your religious community? Could you choose to be a sexual person and still endorse and live your religious values? Josh Weed is a Mormon therapist in Utah who identifies as gay and homosexual, but has specifically chosen to live a heterosexual life and is married with kids. While I don't necessarily agree with Josh's choice, I support his choice as an existentially authentic one. It's one where he sat and wrestled. He said, are my sexual values more important than my religious ones? He actually thought through in a complicated, nuanced, individualized process what choices he wanted to make. And as a result, I think that he doesn't feel some of the conflict that many people might. Ethical porn. Lots of folks, as we start to explore and examine what are their ideas about pornography, many people, for instance, have some ideas that all pornography is immoral in nature, that all pornography is inherently unethical and involves exploitation. One of the ways to potentially examine or challenge this is to say, well, would you feel less guilty if you watched pornography that was ethical, where you knew nobody had been exploited? Lesbians commonly report that they watch gay male pornography. Why? Not because they're religious, and there's nothing to do with religion. But lesbians commonly report they watch gay male pornography, and when I talk to lesbians about it, they report, well, they are feminist, and they don't want to watch porn with women that might have been exploited. And by watching gay male pornography, they now reconcile their behavior with their values so that they don't have to feel bad, because in that pornography they're not worried about the men being exploited, even though in gay male pornography some men are exploited, frankly, but these women don't perceive it that way, and so then they don't feel bad. Exploring these ideas are ways to help people, I think, start to reconcile their values with their porn use. What about helping religious people to talk about potentially watching pornography together? But I think that conversation is not just about pornography. Pornography is just the canary in the coal mine here. Pornography is just the tip of the iceberg. Because once you start talking about pornography, now you need to start talking about masturbation, sexuality, lust, infidelity, and the perception of sexual pleasure as a marriage property. When we get married, I view your sexual pleasure as my property and my sexual pleasure as your property. And each of us can only experience sexual pleasure if we're together and it's about the couple. That is an implicit assumption that a lot of people have, and especially religious couples, that now starts to, as we start to examine those sexual values, offers us now some more nuanced ways to move this conversation down the field. And I'm not saying, again, there's a right or wrong way. I think the health and the benefit of this comes from that exploration and that dialogue, that negotiation. This is a shame mask. These are iron masks that were locked on the heads of people in the 15 and 1600s, especially in Germany. It was a way to humiliate people and to show the community that this person had engaged in a shameful behavior, with the idea that, oh, if we shame them publicly, they won't engage in that behavior again. Well, yeah, they will. We know that now. They just will work harder to keep that behavior secret. And they'll feel worse about themselves about it. They'll have less ability to control their behavior and their desires. We can help patients, especially religious folks who are struggling with all of this, to examine the way that their sexual shame leads them to hide themselves from their thoughts or desires here and gives them less control. Instead, we can help people to normalize those thoughts and feelings and to have compassion with themselves, to view their desire or their arousal as something that happens, that doesn't necessarily control or drive their behavior, that doesn't make them a bad person just because they got turned on by this, or they had a fleeting thought sexually about watching pornography, or that in the middle of the night they were lonely and tired and horny and they watched pornography. And then later the next day, what if they instead looked at it and said, I made a behavior there, I engaged in behavior there that I wish that I hadn't, and I feel a little bad about. So I need to work harder to make better decisions in the future. And I need to think about how to make those better decisions. This is all new territory, though. Therapists are not talking about these issues, and I really think we need to, because these folks who are struggling with these issues, they're not coming to traditional therapists, oftentimes because they know traditional therapy has negative attitudes about religion. A lot of folks within the sex addiction therapy community are saying, well, when these patients go to sex therapist or regular therapist, they're told, don't worry about porn, don't worry about masturbation, it's healthy, just go do it, it's okay. And religious people are not experiencing us as therapists being empathic with their struggle. That is what I hope you've gotten from today, is that the struggle for religious people around pornography is real. They really are in deep pain. The struggle is coming out of the conflict between their values and their behaviors. And we can help with that by helping people to address their sexual shame, the feeling that because they have these desires, they're a bad person, they're addicted to porn, and it's in their brain, and you can't change it. Instead, can we start to unpack some of those nuanced sort of issues and beliefs and offer people a different way of thinking about these things? Offering people the idea that they get to now choose what kind of sexual being they want to be, recognizing that the religious tradition they were raised in wasn't particularly good at addressing sexuality, and that now people like the Religious Institute are exploring new ways that religions can offer healthy sexual values to their congregants. Can we help religious people to start to develop their own ideas around healthy sexuality and integrate it and reconcile it with their religious beliefs? When we start to resolve that conflict, a lot of the pain and struggle and shame and self-loathing potentially goes away. I think we have to do this together. We as therapists, we as a therapeutic community that want to encourage better sexual health within our patients, We have to be willing to talk about these religious issues. We have to be willing to acknowledge that if we don't talk about these issues, that these people who need help are just going to go to the religiously based therapist or the sex addiction therapist who have no training on sexuality and who sexually shame people like Alex Katakis does, trying to force them to comply with socially approved sexual behaviors. That makes people feel worse. We need to together start to acknowledge this struggle, stop shaming people for being religious, stop perceiving them as being immature or weak for having religious values, and start acknowledging now that these people need help. And we are some of the ones that are best prepared to help them with these struggles. And that the way to help them with it is not to try to make them less religious, but to try to help them unpack all of the nuance of these complicated issues so that they now can make authentic adult decisions about what their sexual values should be in congruence with their religious beliefs. I think that's how we start to move this conversation down the field and help people start to deal with where the real problem is coming from. Not religion versus sex, not religion versus porn, but the way religious values lead to the development of moral values against sex that lead to the perception of a person as a sex addict or a porn addict, something they can't change is in their brain, that leads to them feeling sexual shame about their desires. Those are the things, that's the thread that we can now start to unpack with patients and offer them places where they can interrupt that cycle, interrupt that, and now start to make different decisions. It's one of the things I think therapists are actually really, really good at. So I'm on Twitter. This is one of the easy ways to reach me. Shah, I think, is going to be developing a lot more sort of conversations around this and moving these conversations down the field. Josh Grubbs is coming out with a book around religiosity and sexuality and these conflicts. Kenneth Pargament, who I mentioned, is developing an online education program for therapists about helping to address religion within therapy, and it's going to include some conversation around addressing sexuality and the conflict with religious values within therapy. I think these are novel, exciting new directions where we get to help people. And right now we're not. These people are struggling. They're out on their own. And I think it's a door that we can open together. So I look forward to working with all of you. And if you have great ideas on this stuff, if you have things that work as you are working with patients around this, I want to hear them, because I think that that's how we get to work together to help our patients. So thank you. And I'll turn it back over to Heather with Shah.